wisdom.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. And Ruth, I so apologize. And thank you for the bailout here. So I have a little different view, but I think David's data is, the data is the data. A little bit is what you do with the data. So one question I would ask is, how bad is the salience problem with climate change? And it depends a lot on what you mean by salience. So one of the things that is interesting is there is a constituency, I think it's a little bit broader than David talks about, of younger people and Democrats. And there is a changing electorate that is going to continue to make this constituency bigger and bigger. But it is true that the only group of voters who put as very, and where a majority put climate change is very important right now, is adults under 30. So it is a narrow constituency. That said, people have the ability right now to be worried about lots of things at once. If we ask some of the questions that David was asking about the abortion issue, for example, you would have a huge number of voters saying that cost of living is much more important than abortion. And only 9% saying abortion is the most important problem facing the country right now, the most important problem for the president to deal with. On the other hand, if you ask people, what is your most important voting issue? Among women, 46% say climate change and 46% say abortion. So what people think of as overall dominant issue and what they might take to the voting booth, what might motivate them to vote. For example, youth turnout, a very, very big issue now. Climate change plays a very big role in that. And it also depends on how you talk about the issue. When we talk about, and you see in David's data, pollution to the air we breathe, water we drink, extreme weather, it's far more salient to a broader group of people. So part of our problem with salience is we talk about a very large, complex, abstract, long-term collective problem without a decent solution, and I would agree, electric cars are not a decent solution. Hybrids, though, are very, very popular with voters. So again, I think we're drawing a little bit too absolute conclusions by just saying climate change has a salience problem. The second problem we have is that this issue has become very partisanly polarized. And so 80% of Democrats say that the trade-off, the environmental trade-offs are worth the economic costs. And 74% of Republicans say that the environmental payoffs are not worth the economic costs. So you come in having alienated about 41% of the population because this issue has become very, very partisanly polarized. Framing climate change as a threat is really, really good for fundraising, and that's why it appears to dominate. It's really good for social media clicks. It's really good for building followers on social media. It's really good for having activists respond to you positively, but it is demobilizing. You can't scare people threats. You can scare them into giving you money, but you can't scare people straight. Fear produces fight or flight, and complexity is overwhelming. So people need to know, one, that solutions are possible. Telling people that they only have 10 years and it's all over, and giving them no example of a small-scale solution, and Ruth, I want to adopt your language, demobilizes everyone but core activists. We need to make solutions seem possible. We need to show examples of small changes that made a difference. We need to show an example of coming together and making that difference. We need to message from an asset framing, not a deficit framing. And we need, in particular, to overcome cynicism. Opposition is much less of a problem for us than cynicism is, and people feel just absolutely overwhelmed. Then there are the trade-offs conversations. Americans like having it all, and they like having it all at once. Although there is an increasing perspective in everything from women's lives to climate change that having it all at once is virtually impossible, really exhausting, and costs a lot of money. But we do want to say that we do want to get away from the winners and losers frame. We do want to truly solve problems and show the economic impact. And right now, we have a problem with that. You're not going to convince a coal miner or a petrochemical worker in Texas that they're going to get the same high-paying job for renewable or green energy that they have in coal and petrochemicals. We need to talk about a transition. And we promised this before, right? We've promised this from the days of the spotted owl. And those timber workers are still, and those timber communities are still really hurting and really largely on their own. So we have to talk about general benefits, but we also have to paint the future message. We don't paint a future that is positive. We paint a future that is negative. No one's going to jump on board for a negative future. And besides, I love that statement about Martin Luther King didn't start his speech with, "I have a nightmare." I will also say that Martin Luther King didn't start his speech with, "I have a problem for you." Americans have lots of problems. They don't need yours. They don't need an extra one. Their kids are also hammering them, and their grandkids are hammering them about climate change. And many women in particular say that they get their view of climate change from their children or grandchildren. So we have to show, paint a picture of the future that is positive. Another saying that we have in our business from Anat Shanker-Osorio is that we often sell the recipe. As activists, we love to sell the recipe. We don't sell the brownie. People don't buy. Does Duncan's Heinz brownie mix or Ghirardelli brownie mix show you all the ingredients, like 2 broken eggs and a bar of margarine or butter on the front of the cover? No, they show you a beautiful iced brownie. We got to sell the brownie, not the recipe. Green lash is definitely a problem. There's no question about it. And it is big because it is perceived to be big because people perceive it to be loud. And loud trumps big in this case. Loud makes people think that things are big. For example, in another arena, we've done work on climate, in factory towns, which are towns that have lost their manufacturing base, small towns. And we've hemorrhaged, as Democrats, we've hemorrhaged the vote there. These towns are about 50-50, Democrats and Republicans. But we went in and polled people and we said, how Republican do you think or Democratic do you think your neighborhood is, your community is? The Democrats said it's 60% Trumpers to 40% Biden people, 60% Republicans to 40% Dems. And the Republicans said the same thing, 65 to 35. We had controlled it for 50-50. But the Trumpers are loud, and so people think they're big. Loud and big are two different things. Greenwashing is also a big problem. We talk in this room about green lashing, but greenwashing is actually the bigger problem. That everybody is using the green solution and making people feel, well, like I'm doing my bit for this. The escalating tactics, I cannot wait for Omar's presentation. Of all of our presentations, honestly, that's the one I feel like I'm going to learn the most about, because I want to understand, because there was a lot of escalating tactics in the Civil War, in the Civil Rights Movement. And let us remember that polling shows in the era of the 60s that the civil rights efforts would never have passed if they required a majority vote. So I'm not the expert, but I'm really interested in hearing the expert. But I will say that the tactics do two things that are negative. They may have a lot of positive benefits, and I can't wait for Omar to tell us. One thing they do is the way the press covers them, it's very often covered from a terrorist frame. So let me take another example. There was the Stonehenge example, but ABC's coverage of the congressional ball game being disrupted because it was Chevron sponsored. The self-described youth-led group Climate Defiance took credit for the protest and shared videos on X of protesters rushing the field, calling the Chevron-sponsored game unconscionable. That sounds like terrorism. That's how we report terrorist attacks. Now, maybe some of us believe these are terrorist attacks, but we need a different kind of coverage and a different kinds of positioning to have these tactics be successful. And then lastly, and I think we're going to have a lot of talk, and Rui is definitely an expert on this, of the blue collar vote, it also sounds like privilege. It's hard to argue to working class people who now in this inflationary era have to have 2.5 jobs to get by, that blocking traffic is making their lives better. So we often see in the environmental movement, and we've returned to an era of seeing, rather than environmental justice, as seeing as a privileged movement, particularly even at some core constituencies, like the numbers have moved very rapidly among African Americans, for example. So I think there are lots of challenges, and I think there are lots of things that are raised here that are very important points, but I would argue sometimes the conclusions that we're making are not the correct conclusions. And Omar, I can't wait to hear your comments.
Yeah,